There is a particular kind of worry that has become common in living rooms across America, and Leonard Sax opens his book, Boys Adrift, by naming it exactly. A family doctor and psychologist who has spent decades in the same Maryland practice, Sax kept meeting the same puzzle. Bright, capable boys who simply would not engage with school, with work, with the future itself. Their sisters, raised under the same roof by the same parents, were driven and successful. The boys were adrift, floating wherever the current took them, and, most unsettling of all, untroubled by it. This book is Sax's attempt to answer why. He identifies 5 distinct forces that, working together, are draining the motivation out of a generation of boys and young men. What follows is a summary of his argument, taught in his own order, factor by factor. Before the factors, though, it helps to understand what Sax is not saying. He is not saying boys have always been lazy and nobody noticed until now. He draws a sharp line between the boy who disdains school because he has bigger real-world schemes, Tom Sawyer outwitting Injun Joe, Ferris Bueller ditching class for a day in the city, and the boy he is worried about, who disdains school because he disdains everything. Nothing excites him. That flatness, that absence of passion for any real-world activity is the new thing. And Sax argues it is not an accident of character, but the product of 5 specific and largely fixable causes. The first factor is a transformation in how we school our youngest children. Sax asks the reader to picture a modern kindergarten, which now looks very much like the first grade of 30 years ago. 5-year-olds seated with paper and pencil, drilled in reading and writing, expected to sit still for hours. The trouble is that boys' brains do not develop on the same timetable as girls. Drawing on brain imaging research from the National Institute of Mental Health that tracked the same children over many years, Sax explains that different regions of the brain mature in a different sequence and tempo in girls and boys. The language areas of a typical 5-year-old boy, he notes, resemble those of a 3.5-year-old girl. Asking that boy to read on schedule is, developmentally, like asking a very young girl to do the same. Frustrating and, for some, permanently souring. He points to Finland, where formal schooling does not begin until age 7, and where teenagers nonetheless outperform Americans by wide margins. The lesson is not that later is always better at everything, but that teaching a child before he is ready to learn can teach him above all to hate the classroom. Once a boy decides in kindergarten that school is where he goes to feel stupid, that belief hardens and generalizes, and by 9 he may have written the whole enterprise off. Sax layers 2 further changes onto this one. The first is a loss of what he calls, borrowing from European languages, Kenntnis, knowledge by direct experience, in favor of Wissenschaft, knowledge from books. He tells of watching Swiss schoolchildren led blindfolded to a tree, asked to feel and smell it, then to find it again among dozens, and of Richard Louve's warning about nature deficit disorder, the constellation of symptoms in children raised indoors in front of screens. Girls deprived of that balance will still do the homework, because pleasing the teacher is its own reward for most of them. Boys, who by and large do not share that motivation, simply check out. The second change is the disappearance of competition. Sax argues that many boys are wired to care intensely about an outcome only when there are winners and losers and the result is genuinely in doubt. Team competition in particular, blue team against white team in every subject and sport, as at a boys' school he admires, can light up boys who otherwise stare out the window. Yet schools have systematically stripped competition away, banned dodgeball, and referred boys who write violent adventure stories for psychiatric evaluation, sending an unmistakable message that real boys are not welcome. The result is a boy who feels understood only in the one place that still speaks his language. Video games. The second factor, then, is video games, and here Sax reaches for Nietzsche's phrase, the will to power, to explain what he is seeing. Some boys, more than most girls, are driven above all by the desire to be in charge of their world, to command and to conquer. This shows up in infancy, and, left without a healthy outlet, it finds its purest fix in games like Halo and Grand Theft Auto, which hand the player the power of life and death with a restart button always available. The average teenage boy now plays some 13 hours a week. Some play 20 or more. Sax is careful and fair here. He lets the defenders of games speak, including Stephen Johnson's claim that popular culture is making us smarter, and he concedes that games sharpen reaction time by hundredths of a second. But he marshals the counter-evidence relentlessly. Every study correlating game time with academic performance finds a negative relationship. Some research suggests boys are actually becoming worse at grasping real-world concepts of volume and density than boys a generation ago. Violent games, the evidence indicates, causally increase aggression while diverting blood flow away from the part of the brain that connects motivation to real-world purpose. The deepest harm, Sax insists, is not to intelligence or reflexes, but to a boy's connection to reality itself. The virtual world becomes more real than the one with homework, girlfriends, and consequences. And Sax reports young men who genuinely prefer the game to the girl. The third factor moves from the screen to the medicine cabinet. Sax describes the now familiar sequence. A 5-year-old boy will not sit still, a teacher suggests ADHD, a busy pediatrician offers a trial of medication, and a stimulant, Adderall, Ritalin, Concerta, is prescribed. Boys today are dramatically more likely to be medicated than boys of a generation ago. Sax does not deny that ADHD is real. He grants that Tom Sawyer himself would be diagnosed today. His alarm is aimed elsewhere. First, he cites research showing these medications improve the classroom performance of ordinary children just as much as children with ADHD, which means a good response to the drug proves nothing about the diagnosis. Second, and more gravely, he presents animal studies from Harvard and elsewhere suggesting that stimulants given to the young may damage the nucleus accumbens, the small region that translates motivation into action, producing animals that look normal but have lost their drive. The boy who was agreeable and adventurous becomes, after a year on the medication, lazy and irritable. Sax tells the story of one boy transformed not by a stronger dose, but by a change of school, and draws his rule from it. We should not medicate boys to fit the school. We should change the school to fit the boy. The fourth factor is the one Sax stumbled onto first, and it is the strangest. He begins with feminized fish in the Potomac, male base making eggs instead of sperm at every site tested, and with girls in Puerto Rico entering puberty at 7 and 8. The culprit in both cases points toward endocrine disruptors, synthetic chemicals, especially phthalates and bisphenol A, found in plastic bottles and containers that mimic female hormones. Almost all of these industrial mimics act like estrogen, and they do very different things to girls and boys. In girls, they tend to accelerate puberty. In boys, they slow and disrupt it, blunt masculine development, and appear to damage that same motivation-governing region of the brain. Sax connects the dots to a widening gap in middle schools, to rising rates of ADHD, obesity, and brittle bones in boys, to falling testosterone and sperm counts, and to genital abnormalities in newborn boys whose mothers carried high phthalate levels. He is candid that much of this is association rather than proof, but the pattern is disturbing enough that he devotes the chapters close to Dr. Shanna Swan's practical advice. Glass instead of plastic, no microwaving in plastic, PVC-free toys. Here, the parent who once muttered vaguely about plastics turns out not to have been so wacky after all. The fifth factor is the deepest and the least material. Sax calls it the revenge of the forsaken gods. Manhood, he argues, quoting the memoirist J.R. Möhringer, to be a man, a boy must see a man, is not something that happens automatically with age. It is an achievement, one that every enduring culture has taken great care to guide, leading boys into manhood through a community of men. Orthodox Jews and Navajo, cultures with almost nothing else in common, share this. Women teach girls what it means to be a woman, and men teach boys what it means to be a man. Sax watched what happens when that transmission breaks. He tells of Alaskan native elders who once sat in silence on the ice, teaching young men to hunt the sea lion with patience and reverence, and of the young men now who go out alone, joking and drinking, and wound the animal without killing it. The worst possible outcome. He surveys a culture that has swapped the wise fathers of an earlier era for the bumbling Homer Simpson, that no longer tells boys any believable story of an ordinary man becoming a good one, and that leaves boys to assemble their models from rap videos and video games. When a boy has no community of men, Sax warns, he will look elsewhere, and the results range from the contented slacker to the gang member. The forsaken gods, he says, will have their revenge, meaning that a culture which neglects this transition will pay for the neglect. Between the fourth and fifth factors, Sax pauses to show the wreckage. The end result he calls failure to launch. He introduces contractors who cannot find a single young man willing to learn a trade that would pay 6 figures without a day of college debt. Parents whose 30-year-old sons live at home, content, playing games while their mothers do the laundry. He fills much of this section with the raw emails and chat transcripts that poured in after he wrote a newspaper column on the subject. Accomplished young women describing the short, dispiriting dates with men who will not grow up. The young men themselves, some defiant, some quietly aware that something is wrong. He notes the collapse of marriage, the rise of pornography as a substitute for real intimacy, and the disappearance of the old motivators, money, sex, and duty, that once drove young men to make something of themselves. It is a portrait of comfort without purpose, and Sax argues that a boy subsidized by his parents is, whatever his age, still a child, because adulthood means independence. The final chapter, Detox, is where Sax turns from diagnosis to remedy, and his prescriptions follow the 5 factors in order. For education, know your school, delay kindergarten for a son who is not ready, band together with other parents rather than approaching the principal alone, and seek out formats, including single-sex classrooms, now legal in public schools, and simple fixes like letting boys stand instead of sit, that restore the balance of experience and competition. He points to Germany's forest kindergartens as a model worth studying. For video games, do not merely confiscate the console, but replace it with something more real and more thrilling, whether a contact sport or programs like San Diego's Race Legal, which nearly eliminated deadly street racing by giving boys a legal track. For medication, insist on a genuine assessment against all 5 diagnostic criteria before accepting a label. Be wary of the just try it approach, and remember that a boy who is only inattentive at school may have a school problem, not a brain problem. For endocrine disruptors, choose glass, push industry towards safer materials, and stay informed. And for the loss of role models, deliberately build a community of men around your son. Through a congregation, the Scouts, a team, the outdoors, because he needs more than his father alone. Sax closes with a warning that the answer is not to revive the sexism of old traditional cultures, but to find a third way that honors gender without confining it. And he tells the true story of Joshua Chamberlain, the scholar soldier who chose to fight for his beliefs, and then, at Appomattox, ordered his men to salute the defeated enemy, a gentleman magnanimous in victory, the kind of man Sax believes we have forgotten how to describe to our sons. What the reader carries away from Boys Adrift is a sense that these 5 factors are not a mystery of fate, but a set of choices, most of them reversible. A boy's drive is not a fixed quantity dealt out at birth. It is something a healthy world calls forth and a distorted one lets wither. Sax's deepest conviction, running quietly beneath every chapter, is that a boy is made for more than comfort, made to be tested, to serve, to give himself to something larger than the pleasure of the moment. And that when we arrange his childhood to spare him every difficulty and every real encounter with the world, we do not free him. We hollow him out. The recovery he describes always runs in the same direction, back toward the real, toward the body and the dirt and the community of men, toward purpose. That is a hopeful book disguised as an alarming one. It is well worth reading in full, both for the weight of its evidence and for the picture it draws of what a boy is for.